My name's Simon Hobson. Today's episode, I'm joined by Jill Evans. Jill is from the Rhondda, an area of mid-South Wales. She is a long-standing member of the Welsh political party Plaid Cymru. Between 1999 and 2020, Jill served Wales as a member of the European Parliament. Prior to joining the European Parliament, Jill was community leader working as an elected representative on Borough and County Councils. Croeso, Jill.
Diolch.
So tell the listeners a little bit about who you are, where you come from, your background, and really what brought you to politics, I suppose. There's a lot in that question.
Well, I was born and grew up in the Rhondda, where I've always lived, in a fairly ordinary family, really, not a political family at all. This was a very poor area. It was a coal mining area. I remember when I was young, there were still coal mines open. A lot of people still worked in the mines. And it had always been controlled by the Labour Party. And I remember when I was quite young feeling a great sense of injustice, that people were so poor, that people didn't have much, even though the Rhondda created so much wealth that was exported. And as I got older, as a teenager, I began to take more interest in environmental issues and overseas aid, charities, and so on. And I suppose it was when I went to university, really, in 1977 to Aberystwyth, that I really encountered first-hand politics and campaigning with the Welsh Language Society, with the peace movement, the anti-nuclear movement. And it was then that I really became fully involved. So when I came back to the Rhondda in 1980, I immediately joined the local Plaid Cymru branch and was very active in politics, and until, as you say, I was elected as a borough councillor, then a county councillor, and then went on to do more and more in politics. But it wasn't anything that was taught to me from an early age. It was just an instinct, I think, something that I just developed, and the rest of my family never became involved in politics. And so it wasn't something that I was taught as a child. It was just something that I learned from what I saw around me.
So what brought you to Plaid Cymru as opposed to Labour? As you say, you were sort of imbued in the Labour culture where you brought up, and you mentioned that anti-nuclear, and obviously that was quite heavily dominated by the Labour Party. So why did you get drawn towards Plaid Cymru as opposed to Labour?
Well, I always felt my Welshness very strongly. I was very proud of being Welsh. I think it was a very important part of my identity. I saw how the Labour Party had betrayed communities like mine, and that Plaid Cymru really cared about people, that they cared not just about the Welsh language, because I wasn't brought up Welsh speaking, we were an English speaking family, but cared about people in their own communities and valued people and respected people. And that was something that I saw Labour taking for granted all the time. And I really believed that Plaid Cymru's vision for Wales was one that I wanted as well, and one that I wanted to work for.
So you mentioned the Welsh language there, and it's something I ask all guests of the podcast about, the language use. And I know, as someone who later in life has picked up French and Spanish and trying to learn Welsh, how it alters your view of the world and how you interpret things. So at what point did you embrace learning Welsh and and where, how has that changed your view of things in Wales and how you interpret the world, really?
Well, even in the primary school, when I went to an English language school, but our head teacher spoke Welsh, and so we learned a lot of Welsh songs and Welsh hymns, and then when I went to the grammar school, as it was then, I had a really inspirational Welsh teacher, and I knew that I wanted to become a Welsh speaker, which is not easy, of course, as you know. But I did O-level and A-level Welsh. And then when I went to Aberystwyth, I went to the first year to live in Pantycelyn, which is a Welsh-speaking students' hall. And it was there really that I learned to speak Welsh. I could read and write Welsh before, but it was speaking Welsh was something different in a largely English-speaking area. So it was there that I learned to speak Welsh. And yes, it does change your view on the world. And it does give you a different identity and a different understanding, I think, of everything. And it was, for me, fulfilling something that I'd always wanted to do. And it enriched my life so much. I am never critical of people who don't speak Welsh or who are learning Welsh and think that they will never speak Welsh. But for me, it was really important, and it became so much a part of my identity and my politics that it was something I think I had to do, really. And as I say, none of my family spoke Welsh. Nobody else in my family speaks Welsh now. But it's something that has brought a whole new dimension to my life. And it's something that's been really important.
So how did your parents, were they supportive of that, or was there some resistance?
Not particularly supportive, no. I think they probably didn't understand it in the sense that they didn't understand why it was so important to me. My father was English, so he didn't get it in any case. My mother did, and she went on to go to Welsh classes later. She never learned to speak Welsh, but she did make an effort to learn. But they didn't really understand it. But I think later on, they really admired it. They were full of admiration, I suppose. The fact that I'd learned to speak another language, that I could actually work and exist through the medium of another language, I think they found quite inspiring, even though it was Welsh. And I think probably, my father would have been happier if I'd learned French or another language. But I think they saw how important it was later on. At the time, they weren't particularly supportive.
Yeah. And you mentioned about French there, did the Welsh lead to other languages? And obviously we'll get on to talking about you working in the European Parliament, but apart from your colleagues, there aren't many people in the European Parliament that speak Welsh.
Well, no, but my office always spoke Welsh.
Yeah.
My staff were always Welsh speaking, and so we, in that sense, we always ensured that everyone who worked with us and around us knew that there was a Welsh language and that we used it in our everyday work. And I think that was important in Europe as well.
And you, as it 2004, you made a speech in Welsh in the European Parliament, and that was the first time that had been done in the Welsh language. So was that a conscious act, or just felt natural and the right thing to do?
No, it was a conscious act. We'd campaigned from day one, really. Firstly, to have the right to speak other languages in the European Parliament. I mean, there were 23 official languages. I couldn't understand, and the many groups that came to visit me in the European Parliament, very often from schools or colleges, couldn't understand how there were 23 official languages and Welsh wasn't one of them, when Welsh was an official language in Wales. And so the first thing that I did with my colleagues in Parliament from other small nations was to campaign to change the rule that you couldn't use other languages in the Parliament, because prior to that, the chair would just switch off your microphone if you spoke in another language.
I didn't realise that, no.
So we got that rule changed. Then the next step, of course, was to get our languages recognised and to get interpretation. So when I spoke Welsh in the Parliament, excuse me, there was no interpretation. But at that time, the UK had the presidency of the EU. So Tony Blair was in the Parliament as the president at the time. So I spoke Welsh when Tony Blair was there, and I said in Welsh, and I had to translate myself in English, why can't we use Welsh in this chamber? Why isn't Welsh an official language? It should be an official language. And then we continued to campaign until eventually we got what was called co-official status for Basque, Catalan, Galician, Welsh, Scots, Gaelic. And what that meant was that you could use those languages in the European Parliament, also in the Committee of the Regions and the Council of Ministers, where they would have interpretation. But because of internal politics in the Parliament, we never succeeded in getting interpretation in the Parliament. So even though I could speak Welsh, it wasn't translated. So we've always campaigned for that. Whenever I had events in the Parliament that I organised myself, I always had translation there from Welsh, which was great. But I was really moved in my final speech in the European Parliament before we left because of Brexit. I spoke in Welsh in the Parliament, and the interpreters got in touch with me, with my office, and said, can you send us the text of your speech and also the English translation, and we will ensure that that's put on the record. So there's a record of proceedings, you know, like Hansard in yes. Westminster. And even though they are not really allowed to do that, they did that as a gesture of solidarity, I suppose, and ensured that the translation of what I said was actually on the record as well, which was lovely.
Well, that's very touching. I mean, on multiple levels, both with the respect for yourself and the language, and also the lamentable act of the United Kingdom leaving the European Union. It's a lovely memento. And you worked with, so Plaid Cymru were with the Greens and European Free Alliance as a group. And did that include some of the language groups you've mentioned, like Basques and Catalans? And is there, other than the struggle for recognition of those minority languages in the context of the European Parliament, is there other commonality there with between the parties, or because a lot of people don't really know a lot about the groupings in the European Parliament. So what is the Greens and the European Free Alliance? Why are they together, and who are they really?
Yeah, well, Plaid Cymru had been a member of the European Free Alliance since the early 1980s, and it's an alliance of parties that have a great deal in common. We're all unique, of course, and we very often work on language and culture issues, but also on self-determination. So some of our parties want independence, like Plaid and the SNP and the Catalans. Others want more regional powers. We have the Borough and County from Cornwall, for example. The Yorkshire Party are also members. So it ranges in what powers the parties want for their own regions or nations. But what we had in common in the European Parliament was that even though regional funding has always been a very strong element of what the European Union does, there was no recognition of the regional level of government. The European Union was very much a union of states. And so we were the only group in the Parliament that really put the needs and the contribution of nations and regions on the agenda. So we had a great deal in common. But when I was elected in 1999, we had 10 members elected from the European Free Alliance, which wasn't enough to form our own group. And so we had talks with many other parties, but decided to form a joint group with the Greens because we also had so much in common. Some of the members of the Green parties, and the Green parties are also very different in different countries. Some of them really understood the language and culture and regional issues. Others didn't, so they varied, but we decided to form a group because we had so much in common. And it was based on a political document, a shared document that we signed up to, which in fact has continued to this day. Our parties are still in the same group with the Greens. And when it came to voting in the Parliament, there was very little disparity in terms of voting between IFA and the Greens, because we also felt very strongly about climate change and those issues, and about peace and justice. But we also had, within that agreement, total freedom. So there was no whip within the group. You didn't have to vote a certain way. So when we sat in the Parliament, when we voted in the Parliament, we had total freedom to vote whichever way we wanted. So I could be confident that even though probably 99% of the time I voted the same way as the group, I knew that I could always vote in the interests of Wales in the Parliament, that nobody was going to tell me to vote a certain way. And so we existed very successfully as a joint group, but we also had our own independence. So we were free to do what was in the interests of the people who elected us.
Do you think that freedom is something that was easier to achieve and implement within the workings of the European Parliament as opposed to Westminster or the Senate, because of sort of the Westminster first past the post structure? It encourages that towing the line adversarial approach to things. So how do you, from your time in the European Parliament, what and that freedom in voting and with your conscience and your party's belief system, but still collaborating where you can collaborate. And that's something that, I think frustrates a lot of voters within the whole of the United Kingdom, is why are people always trying to make cheap points at Prime Minister's questions, for example, in Westminster, rather than actually saying, well, yes, we go along with that. Perhaps we could offer our help to suggest something else, but it's always point scoring. So is there something from your experience that you could talk about around that? And
yes, I think you're absolutely right. The culture in the European Parliament was quite different. There was no government. We sat in the hemicycle, we had a circular chamber. So there was no government and opposition. And so if you wanted to bring about a change in legislation, or if you wanted something done, you had to work with other parties, with your own group, of course, but also with other groups. And that's why there was so much consensus within the European Parliament. And it's not easy. I think achieving consensus can sometimes be harder than just voting for or against something, because you have to compromise. And finding the compromise where you can achieve an agreement without totally sacrificing your own beliefs and values can be a very difficult process. But it's something that was done in the European Parliament, and it was done of necessity. And that was the culture. So there wasn't the kind of bickering and the shouting and the heckling that you see at question time in Westminster, partly because we were all wearing headphones and having interpretation from different languages, but also partly because that just wasn't the culture. And in the very last few years, when I was in the European Parliament, when there were substantial numbers of UKIP members elected, and they did bring that sort of negative culture into the Parliament, it was very dimly viewed. That wasn't the way that the Parliament worked, and it wasn't the way the Parliament wanted to work. And I think that consensus working, for me personally, it was very challenging, but also very enriching as a politician. But also, I think it's probably why we had such a high percentage of women in the European Parliament. It was a way of working that suited everyone. You didn't have to stand up and argue all the time. There was much more talking and reasoning and weighing up issues and seeking a way forward that benefited everyone, as you said.
And yeah, I think that less adversarial approach would go a long way personally to involving a lot more people in politics within Wales and the United Kingdom. People that we need, people with some valid views, but are turned off by the aggression and the sort of alpha male approach to things. But you mentioned UKIP there, and I guess they were elected as a disruptor, really, and anti the establishment they joined. And we see now, Nigel Farage's new venture with reform, and I think there's probably many people that feel they would like to vote for them, not necessarily because they believe in them, but because they do feel very frustrated, as they did with the European Parliament, and hence why UKIP members got voted. And so I think, it'd be quite interesting to hear your views on what your ideas and maybe solutions are to talking to those people that feel frustrated and feel that they really need some dramatic change within the Senate and the United Kingdom Parliament, and therefore are thinking about voting reform for no other reason.
Well, I think one of the things I learned being an MEP was so many people thought that they didn't understand Europe and how Europe worked. And the media always promoted this. And actually, it was quite simple. And it wasn't hard to understand at all. And yet there was this mystery about Europe created, that it wasn't democratic, that nobody knew what happened, and that Europe was dictating to the UK what it should do. I mean, none of that was true. And one of the things that I spent 20 years doing in the European Parliament was trying to show people in Wales how important Wales was in the European context. I mean, Wales is a bilingual nation, a small nation, which was normal in Europe. A modern, outward-looking nation, which again was normal in a European setting. But I think a lot of the difficulty that we face is because people feel so alienated from politics, and they don't feel that things that happen to them in their everyday life are important to politicians, which of course they are, or they should be. And everyone is involved in politics. You know, it's not just politicians. Everyone is involved. And one thing I've always done is campaigned. And when I was a councillor and when I was an MEP, I always got involved in campaigning, because I think one thing that people should never accept is that something can't be done or can't be changed. Things can always be changed. And that's what I hope I always demonstrated to people, and I showed people. And I know people feel excluded, and I know people feel powerless, and I know people want to have a go at the establishment and the system. I understand that. But the way to do that is by becoming involved and changing things and realizing your own power and doing it yourself, because reform are not going to change things for people in the Rhondda or people in Wales, for ordinary working class families. They don't have answers to the problems that face us. And it's a massive challenge for politicians to persuade people, to show people that that is the case. But it really is. And I'm not a politician now. I'm not elected in any capacity, but I still work in my community, and I still work with the peace movement. And showing people their own power is so crucial to everything we do.
I think a lot of what you've just highlighted there comes down to educating and understanding at an early age your abilities and also your responsibilities as part of the community. And you know, with that thought, you know, the government of Wales has introduced, or is slowly introducing, a new curriculum, and you've done over your career in politics a lot on education. And as I understand it and interpret, the intention of this new curriculum is to move away from constant testing and badgering of children and trying to get them to think more critically and go into the working world with an ability to appreciate how to learn and teach yourself and adapt to the world, which obviously is critical with all the things that are happening in the world and are only likely to change more rapidly as life moves on. So what's your views on that new curriculum, and other things that you would add to it or that you've learned from your life that are being missed, opportunities missed?
Yes, I think Wales has really led the way on so many of these issues. I mean, we have the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which is an incredible piece of legislation, really groundbreaking. I know there are criticisms that it isn't implemented fully, and they are genuine, but the fact that we have that act, I think, is amazing. And I have to say that I had many, many young people from Wales who came to Brussels on work experience when I was in the Parliament. Very often they would just come for a week or for 2 weeks, and they were amazing. And I was so proud to be able to introduce them to other people in the Parliament and to show just what Wales had to offer, and their talent and their understanding and their enthusiasm for Europe was just incredible. And so that was really inspiring, and the work I did with schools and others was really inspiring. But I also do a lot of work, as I said, with the peace movement. And one thing that just baffles me is that we've just uncovered the amazing history of a peace petition from the women of Wales to the women of the United States, which was delivered to them in 1924. And it was signed by nearly 400,000 women in Wales. And it was after the First World War. And it was an attempt to stop another war happening. Now, this is a fantastic piece of our history in Wales, everybody's history. And yet it's been totally hidden. And nobody knew about it. It wasn't taught in schools. And even people like myself who've been active in the peace movement for years, we knew nothing about this. Well, now, thanks to the Welsh Centre for International Affairs in the Temple of Peace in Cardiff, there's an education pack about this, which can be used by schools to teach children not just about the petition, but about what peace means, about what being Welsh means, about how they look at Wales in a world context, and all of these things that are happening, which a lot of people in Wales don't realise, I think, that in the field of education, we have achieved so much, and there's a lot more to do, but it's something that we should be promoting so much more widely and giving much more emphasis to. I think that the way that we look at education, not just school education, but also adult education, is so critical to the way that we build citizenship, that we should be talking a lot more about that and about what we should be doing and how we can move forward with that.
Absolutely. So your passion for the peace movement is obvious when you speak, and does that come from a religious perspective, or do you approach that just because it seems sensible and logical?
Yes, I think it's something that I've always felt very strongly. Probably the first meeting I ever went to, public meeting, was in Aberystwyth when I went to college, which was a meeting called to oppose the dumping of nuclear waste in mid-Wales. And it was just from that point on, really, that I got involved and I never stopped. I was involved in CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, from the early 80s. Of course, at a time when we really thought a nuclear war was going to happen. People were really frightened. I went on the original march to Greenham Common, and I spent time in Greenham Common. I was involved in all kinds of campaigning, and I still am. And I was one of the founders of our Academy Heddwch, our Peace Institute in Wales. which has been set up just in the last few years, but very much based on the experience of the Flemish Peace Institute and the Åland Islands Peace Institute and others that I've worked with. So I'm still very deeply involved with the peace movement, and it's something that has always been central to my politics as well.
I guess what I was trying to get at is that what's the kernel inside you that sort of makes you feel that that's something that you want to give so much of your time and energy to? What is it about that particular thing?
Well, it comes back to peace and justice again. I think I believe nothing is solved by violence or by war. We have to take what is very often the more difficult road to achieving peace, which is through dialogue and through respect for other people's rights. And throughout my time as an MEP, I was a member of the delegation to Palestine, for example. So I saw there all the injustice of the Palestinian people. I worked with the Kurds, with the Western Sahara peoples. So I've seen injustice at first hand, and I've always believed that peace and justice are possible. It's not religious. It's just something that I feel instinctively that people have a right to.
Yeah, I'm quite interested to hear your view on how you approach that with what's going on in Ukraine and someone like Putin, who seemingly doesn't want to have the conversation.
Yeah, well, when I was in the European Parliament, and there was talk at that time about having a European army and about putting more money into defence. I mean, of course, that's much more now than it was then. But I always promoted and supported the idea of a European force and a European security force, because I think security and defence are two very different things, but not made up of soldiers with guns, but made up of teachers and nurses and lawyers and social workers who could work within areas where there was possible conflict to try and dissipate that conflict before it ever even started. The United Nations has a peacekeeping force, of course, and Plaid Cymru policy is that we would support that and become part of that peacekeeping force. But it's only really stopping fighting, literally. So it's not what we would call positive peace. Positive peace is much more than just the absence of war. It's about people living together and respecting one another's rights. And that's something that I think the European Union could really develop and play a world leading role in, but it hasn't. It has instead gone down the path now of putting billions of euros into so-called defence policy, which is creating more armaments. I don't think that's ever going to be an answer. And of course, we have to deal with people like Putin. But I honestly believe that if the majority of people are against war and want to prevent war, then we can do that too.
Yeah, well, as I understand history, it was a driving force behind what is now the European Union, bringing the countries and peoples of Europe together so that we didn't have those in the future, which was obviously lost in the Brexit debate. Didn't seem to matter to anybody. But I think maybe now is a time it perhaps should be resurrected and people reminded of that reason for unity in Europe. So many of the people who talked about education there, and many people do finish education or are entrepreneurial, but they don't feel, for whatever reason, that Wales has a future for them. And as we discussed before we started recording, I have been interviewing individuals that are part of the Welsh diaspora and who have made good lives for themselves elsewhere in the world. And sometimes that might only be moving to London, but many people obviously move further afield. So what's your view on why that occurs and how we can go about bringing those people either directly back to Wales or bringing their wealth into Wales or their knowledge? Because obviously being out in the world, you bring a great deal of knowledge that can benefit the nation of Wales.
Well, I think we have to inspire people with the vision of what Wales can become and what part Wales can play. And I know that as an MEP, I went to so many countries and so often came across people who had links with Wales, if not, came from Wales themselves. And to give something back, I think we have to show people that it will make a difference. And to do that, we have to really believe that Wales is a small nation, but can have a big impact on the world stage. And we do have a voice. I know that since 99, we had the Assembly, now the Senedd. And I don't believe that Wales's voice has really been heard. I don't believe that we've had a government in Wales that has really shown what a difference Wales can make internationally. And it's really time that we did that, because we can change things. We can have an influence. We do have a voice. We do matter. We make a difference. And if people see that, then they'll want to be part of that.
It's something that at the new.wales launch, Paul Silk drew on, that the Irish and the Irish government do very well, and that is reaching out to their diaspora and getting them to invest or be involved in the politics or be involved in entrepreneurial processes. And they do a lot of consulting with their diaspora as to what is going to work for them as far as bringing new businesses into Ireland. And from my experience and knowledge, that isn't something that the Welsh government or indeed the populace of Wales seem particularly switched on to. So how would you go about that? How would you go about bringing people back into Wales or getting people interested in setting up businesses or subsidiaries of their businesses in Wales?
Well, I think it's about making those links. I mean, I went to Ireland. I've been to Ireland many times, but I went before the European elections in 1999 and saw how they did it on a very local level. The further education colleges there drew up their curriculum in partnership with the local businesses in that area. So they could be sure that when young people finished school or college, they had the right skills to work in those industries. Now, that's on a very local level, but that needs to be done on an international level as well. It's about looking at the kind of Cymru that we want to build and how people can contribute to doing that. The Welsh Government, of course, have a leading role in that, but a lot of other sectors do as well. And it's about having a vision for the nation that we want. A lot of us want Wales to become independent, but even those who don't at this stage can help to create that vision of what a thriving, prosperous Wales would look like, and how they can play a part in achieving that. We have so much potential, and yet we don't recognize that potential. And that's something that we need to do, and we need to talk to other people about how we achieve it.
Now, I know that when I lived in France, which was 20 years ago, a lot of the people I got to know there, they had said to me that the schools there, at the end of the formal schooling process, the local visitors would be invited to the schools, and they'll have conversations with children, and they'll present their business, and many would then find themselves working in those businesses from that. And it's a simple thing to do, really. But obviously, as things move forward, and technologies and the world of work changes, then we're going to need the groundwork and the legislation and the policies in place in Wales that's going to allow this adaptability. And I know a personal view, I think that a lot of Wales's woes are the entrenched mindset of this is what work is and this is how you go to work. And there's a great deal of opportunity. So there's a great deal of talent, but at the moment the talents feels that there isn't the opportunity for them in Wales, so they're leaving. So I don't know that on this podcast we're going to find the solution to that. but it's something that I do think needs a great deal of deeper and collaborative work across the political spectrum, because it's, after all, for the greater good of the citizenry of Wales. Can
I just give you an example of something? When I was in Parliament, I did a report. I was the author of a report on language equality in the digital age, and it was looking at obviously, digital things, languages online. And so even though we had 23 or 24 official languages in the European Parliament, most of them, when you went online, were extinct. They didn't exist at all. Some of the languages like Latvian and Lithuanian, they didn't. It was all English or American, which dominated online. And it identified the ways, with the proper investment, in which minority languages as well, like Welsh, could actually achieve equality in the digital world with all other languages. And the European Commission were actually planning to invest massively in that. I don't know if that's happened with subsequent events. But one of the main drivers of all this was Bangor University. And the unit in Bangor University, which had done really groundbreaking work in this, contributed so much to that report. And they came to Brussels and they took part in seminars and so on. And it was something that, again, in Wales, we were leading the way in that kind of work, but nobody knew. And there's so much that we need to showcase about Wales that we are doing, but people just don't know at the moment. And so we need to be making much more about our successes and not just our frustrations and failures, which we sometimes tend to do.
Yes, well, as someone that's whose partner works in communications, I fully agree. That's a very important aspect of modern world. So you were, am I right? You were the first female president of Plaid Cymru? Is that correct?
Yeah.
And that was in 2010. So it made me think. One of the things I've come across, even as a man, is through conversation, is a great deal of misogyny in Wales. And is that something that you've found with your career and your ambitions? And today, I'm thinking of conversations of only last week where I thought, well, that's not really appropriate. So, what's your take on that and your personal experiences?
In my personal experience, yes, I've seen it, I've experienced it, but it's never held me back, really. I think that when I wanted to do something, I would do it. Nothing comes easily, but you do work hard to get what you want. And maybe I've been lucky, but I've also been quite determined. I think it's something that we see and we recognize a lot more these days. Whereas in the past it's been dismissed. I think it is recognized now, which is good. And I think Plaid Cymru was the first party to actually commission a report to look at how we worked and how misogyny and other elements existed within our organisation. And we published that, which was not an easy thing to do. But since we did that, many other organisations have done the same. So I hope that we were amongst the first to recognise and to address the problems. But yes, it is a big problem, and that's why it's so important that in the Senedd elections next year, that a lot of women and hopefully other representative groups are elected, so that the parliament that we have in Wales actually reflects the population of Wales. And I do hope too that by women working more together, we've always had a women's section in Plaid Cymru, which when I was young, when I was first involved in the party, was an enormous support to me. And I don't think I could ever have progressed in politics without the support of the women's section when I was in my early 20s. And I do hope that the women's sections and groups and networks that exist now do provide that same support for young women that I experienced. Within the European Free Alliance on a Europe-wide level, we have a women's network which aims to provide that kind of mentoring and support for women. And I hope that will make a difference.
Yeah, and well, let's hope so. Let's hope so. And certainly the variety of individuals that Wales has in its society is currently lacking from the Senedd. So we hope that will change. I'd like to talk a bit about independence and probably more about post-independence, and really sort of I'm drawing on the 2017 Catalan election, where the electorate there voted for Catalonia to separate from Spain. And obviously that was met with denial by the Spanish courts and said it was illegal, and a fair bit of police aggression towards individuals there. So I suppose my question is really, if Wales was to get to a point where it had the referendum and the majority of Wales's citizens were to vote for it, how do we ensure that that it's accepted and also peacefully accepted, so we don't see that type of aggression in the streets of Aberystwyth or Bangor or Cardiff?
Well, what happened in Catalonia was a scandal that should never have happened within the European Union or anywhere. I worked very closely with the Catalans, and I went as an official observer to each election and referendum that took place, even in the early days when it started as a movement that was based on towns and villages voting. And I was there for the final referendum, and many of those imprisoned, the politicians who were imprisoned after that, were friends of mine, and I visited them in prison as well. So I saw that whole process, and the complete lack of democracy and recognition of self-determination was just unbelievable. Now, I also went to Scotland as an observer for the referendum there, which of course people voted not to support independence at that time, but they're planning a further referendum. In Wales, I believe that we have to go down the democratic route. I mean, we are seeing support for independence rise incredibly now. And although I don't have a lot of faith in the Westminster government, it has to be something that is agreed on a UK level. We have to have a very clear pathway to achieving our independence. And we're outside the EU now, so it can't be done through an EU level, which was never adopted in any case. But it has to be done democratically. And I believe, despite what happened in Catalonia, that there is an inalienable right for a majority of people who want democratically for their country to be independent, that has to happen, and it has to happen peacefully and democratically. And it means that a lot of us have an awful lot of work to do. It's not just about the people of Wales wanting independence. We have to demonstrate to people in other nations of the UK that is what, not just what we want, but that is best for everyone. It will benefit the whole of the UK as well as benefiting the people of Wales. But I do believe that it is inevitable. It will happen, and it will happen in Scotland too. And the Westminster government, the UK government, has to recognise that and prepare for that.
Of course, there's many people who, I guess, for want of a better term, it would be indie curious. And the thing that makes them uncomfortable is that uncertainty, and also the memory of Brexit and that referendum and the divisiveness of that. And again, looking at Catalonia, I think my numbers are right, is 42% of the eligible electorate actually voted in that, and 90% of them voted for yes to independence. So, I mean, that's obviously a majority within a minority of the electorate, which is something that we saw with Brexit as well. So there, in my mind, there would need to be, some safeguards, a requirement for a supermajority for something as momentous as ceding from United Kingdom for Wales. Is that something that Plaid Cymru has a policy on, or have you got personal views on that, like numbers, and how would you safeguard that you're not going to have the perpetual rift between individuals as we have with Brexit?
That's really interesting. I think you're absolutely right, and people have changed their minds since the Brexit vote. And I honestly believe if that vote was taken again today, that we would see a different result. So there have to be safeguards to ensure that such a massive decision is made by people in the full knowledge of what that would lead to. And I think with Brexit, one of the problems was that no one knew what would happen afterwards. There were some wild promises made, which were never kept, of course, about where our money would go and how much would go into the NHS. That was never going to happen. But there was never proper debate about Brexit, and everything became polarized. It was easy to blame someone else for our problems. If we are to have a proper debate about independence, it can't be on that model. It has to be about the Wales that we want to see in future, and maybe the UK that we want to see in future, and how that develops as well. One of the things that really impressed me about the referendum in Scotland was that when the Scottish government published the act, I suppose it would have been, for the referendum, that copies were distributed far and wide to people. I remember canvassing an elderly lady in Glasgow, who she opened the door and she had a copy of it on the table in the hall, and she'd been reading it. Now, I know that the referendum in Scotland, they voted no eventually, but I did get the impression that people understood what they were voting for and why they were voting and what would come next, despite the efforts, the last minute efforts by the Westminster government to frustrate that vote. I do think that the Scottish government led a long conversation about independence, which was undermined at the end. But that's what we have to do, and that's why it's so good that the discussion about independence for Wales is happening now and has been happening for a number of years. A long time before we're in a position to say confidently that there's a majority of people in Wales for independence. That's why it's so important that people are indie curious and want to know more. If they didn't care, if they said, oh, don't talk to me about it, that would be a problem. But the fact that people want to talk about it, want to know more, want to have the facts and figures, and they want to know what the future will look like, I think that's something that should give us all a lot of hope, because we need that long conversation. We need people to be confident that if they vote yes to independence, then their lives will be better and Wales will be better.
And I think a strength that Wales has is the conversation isn't being dominated, as was the case in Scotland, by a single political party. And Plaid Cymru are not the only party that support independence. Also,
no.
There's a sizable chunk of the Labour that think it's the right way to go. And for what's left of the Liberal Democrats in Wales, some in that party as well. And it really, New Wales has formed to have these conversations, and we want these conversations with unionists as well and federalists, because it is, as you hinted at, we need to have the conversation now. We need to explore all of the difficult questions that have been ignored for so many years. Why is the status quo as it is, and as you also alluded to, not recreating that aggressive, negative forum that was Brexit. Not saying, well, it's all Westminster's fault, it's all England's fault. Looking at the shortcomings within Wales and Welsh people, and how we can do things better for ourselves. That is the purpose of New Wales as an organisation. So it's great that you've given time to speak with us about everything. Thank you very much. I wondered, as a sort of final sort of question to you, where do you envision Wales in 15 years' time? How do you see it as a nation? What does it look like, feel like? Where is it in the global family?
Well, I hope Wales will be independent. I hope Wales will be a member of the European Union. I believe we should never have left, but that we have an opportunity to rejoin as an independent nation. I hope that we'll support and help reform the United Nations to have a better global order and a more peaceful world. And I hope that young people in Wales will achieve their full potential. I've got several grandchildren who are nothing but positive about the future. And I hope that energy will build a nation that we can all be really proud of, and that we can all play our part in creating, because I think that Wales has the potential to be fantastic.
Jill Evans, diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your time.
Diolch.
If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more conversations with people who want to build the future of Wales. And do go and find, like and enjoy new.wales across all your favourite social media channels.